It's just over a month now, I think, until the US presidential elections. And if you're anything like me, you are probably fed up with all the coverage that is being given to them, and you're probably fed up with hearing about them. So I apologise in advance that I'm now going to speak a little bit about them, because the one thing that seems to me obvious about them, but also so heartbreaking, is how entrenched both sides have become in their own positions. Whatever the Republicans do, or say, or think, the Democrats are against. Whatever the Democrats do, or say, or think, the Republicans are against. And the leaders, both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, are figures of hatred for the people on the other side of the political spectrum. There have already been 2 assassination attempts in the political campaign period alone. And I was reminded of just how absurd this tribal mentality has become when I saw a clip earlier this week from an American TV show. A reporter had gone off, this is all true, a reporter had gone off to interview supporters of Donald Trump and was asking them about things that Joe Biden, the Democratic president, had said. So the reporter would say, Joe Biden said this. What do you think about that? And the Trump supporter would say, what an idiot! One said, Joe Biden must have dementia. Somebody else said, what he said is unforgivable. I'd never vote for somebody who said that. But there was a twist. The reporter then said, actually, I'm sorry, I got that quote wrong. It was actually Donald Trump who said it. And then the reporter would ask them the same question again. What do you think about the quote? What do you think they said? Well, same person, but the answer totally changed. They would try to justify what was said, accept it, adopt it. Oh yes, that's perfectly sensible. Would it stop you voting for Donald Trump? No, of course not. Exactly the same quote, exactly the same people, but totally different responses from the supporters, depending on who they were told had said it. And so when we hear our gospel reading from Mark today, the parallels are clear. There, Jesus' disciples were acting tribally. They say to Jesus, we saw someone casting out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he was not following us. So, what are they saying there? They're saying, we saw someone doing good, doing something you would do, Jesus, and we tried to stop him. Why? Because he's not one of us. If it was you doing these things, Jesus, we'd be all for them. But it was him. He's not our guy. So we tried to stop him. And Jesus immediately puts them in their place. He calls out their hypocrisy. Do not stop him, Jesus said. Whoever is not against us is for us. We all want the same thing here. We all want that good outcome. So what does it matter if someone else is taking the lead? What does it matter if they are achieving the same result in a different way to the way we would do it? Don't stop them doing good and let them do it in their own way. And that got me thinking, do we ever do something similar? Do we ever criticize the way someone's doing something because it's not the way that we would do it? Or because it's different from what we're used to? It might be as simple as how something is cooked. Well, that's not how I'd do it. Or the format of a church service. That's not how we usually do things around here. Whatever it might be. Why are we criticizing and getting in the way? And how might it make that person feel? Sad? Annoyed? Unappreciated? Maybe they'll start to think, I won't bother again in the future. And where would that leave us? And I think it's really that Jesus is getting at next when he goes on to develop his theme in the passage that we heard. He goes on to tell his disciples that they must not place stumbling blocks in front of someone who believes. And let's think through what that means. Someone who believes. If someone believes in God and Jesus' message, then presumably they are actively trying to do good. And by getting in their way or causing them to stumble, we might be preventing them from fulfilling that cardinal rule that we know from the parable of the Good Samaritan, loving their neighbour, by criticising them, by weakening their willpower, by making them lose motivation to do whatever it is that we've criticised. Might we inadvertently be getting in the way of a kind and loving act? So this man that we hear about in the gospel had been out doing good, loving his neighbours. And the disciples there were criticising him, trying to stop him, trying to put a stumbling block in his way. And so just pausing for a moment, I invite everybody to just reflect and ask ourselves, when might we be being too critical of someone else? When might we be digging our heels into our own position, lacking a bit of understanding for someone else? To our family members, or our friends, maybe our colleagues at work. And I won't ask anybody to put their hand up and say what they are thinking of. But let's also ask ourselves, next time that happens, what can we do differently? Now, Jesus goes on in this passage to illustrate his point quite graphically. Work out what's causing you to stumble, he says, and chop it off. Maybe it's something that's preventing us from loving our neighbour. Maybe it's something that's causing us distance between us and God. Maybe it's our obsession with earthly things, our pride, our greed, our wrath, our envy, our lust, our gluttony, or our sloth. Or maybe it's something causing us to criticise someone else and getting in the way of their loving acts, as the disciples had been doing in the first part of the reading. But whatever it might be, Jesus tells us, chop it off. You don't need it. If your hand causes you to stumble, chop it off. It's better to be maimed and be with God than have two hands and be without him. If your foot causes you to stumble, chop it off. It's better to have one foot and be with God than have 2 feet and be without him. And if your eye causes you to stumble, tear it out. It's better to have one eye and be with God than 2 eyes and be without him. So hopefully when you came in, you were given a small square of cardboard with a heart on it. And I'd like you to pick that up now, and hopefully you have a pen as well. If you don't have either of those things, I think we have some more by the door. And I'd like you to take a moment to just write on it. So just write on it what it is that each one of us, what it is that you feel like you need to chop off. And I don't mean physically. Please, as a result of this sermon, do not end up in A&E. No. I am talking about the things that we do. What is it that's causing us to stumble? What's causing us distance from God or from our neighbour? And in writing it down, we can identify that issue and we can focus on changing it. And don't worry as well, I'm not going to be collecting these in and marking what you've written. These are for you. So be honest to yourself. What do you need to chop off? And once you've written down whatever it is that you think is causing you to stumble, just fold up that part and pop it in your pocket. And I invite you to keep it with you this week and regularly open it up, look at it, think on it, pray with it. And then, sticking with the same passage from today, Jesus finishes off this bit of teaching with a saying that's particularly relevant when I look around my feet. It's a saying about salt. I have absolutely no doubt that at least 50% of the things down here have salt added to them. It's something we use all the time. So let's think about salt for a minute. Salt was something that everybody back in biblical times would have used for lots of different things. It was used to preserve foods, and it was very effective at that because it draws out the moisture from the food and therefore prevents the space for bacteria, yeast and other things to develop. And for the same reason they could use it to disinfect things. It might have been used in salt water to cleanse and heal wounds. And importantly, still importantly for us, it was used as flavouring. We all know how good chips taste with a bit of salt on them, or ready salted crisps. Whatever meal you're preparing, the chances are you'll have added some salt. And Jesus' reference to salt in this passage is to that, it's to taste. He says this great phrase, "Salt is good, but if salt has lost its saltiness, how can you season it? Have salt in yourselves and be at peace with one another." Now, when people in Palestine were using salt back then, it was often in a very impure state. It wasn't the beautiful white powder that comes freely flowing out of your bottle of table salt. And as you'd expect, if there were more impurities in the salt than actual salt, the salt would be pretty bland. It wouldn't be salty anymore. And you'd start thinking, what's the point in this concoction? Might as well throw it away. And so Jesus is saying here, if you're salt, make sure you're salty. Make sure you're fulfilling your purpose. And so if we were all made in God's love, in God's image, which is love, are we fulfilling that purpose of loving our neighbour? Are we being useful to our neighbour? And the comparison goes even further with this word, because in our modern English vocabulary, salty has a couple of possible meanings. Yes, one, it means tasting of salt, unsurprising. So if we're using it in that sense, if salt is salty, it's useful, it's fulfilling its purpose. But in English, salty can also mean annoyed, upset, critical. So somebody might make a salty comment, or you might say, oh, he's being very salty. So bringing all that together then, at this harvest time of year, maybe we can ask ourselves that salty question in this way. It's the same question that we wrote on our hearts. Are we salty, useful, fulfilling our purpose, loving? Or are we salty, critical? And it's only the useful salt that Jesus wants. And that really goes to the very heart of everything we believe. It pulls in the Good Samaritan passage. What do we need to do to inherit eternal life? Love. Love God. Love your neighbour. That's it. That is our faith. So, how salty are you? Amen.